Hello, my dear friends. In a place of supreme power and tens of kilos of dresses, the Queen can go a month without touching a drop of water. Not because she is busy, but because she is afraid of bathing. Behind the scent of roses is sweat soaked deep into the silk. Behind the fragrant gloves is a layer of powder that has not been washed for a week. The palace is bright, but under the velvet curtains, on the feather pillows, is a smell that history has not recorded. Tonight, you will step into the real backstage of the royal family, where secrets are not washed clean. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you've ever pictured a royal woman stepping out of a velvet-draped carriage, walking past marble columns into a candlelit palace chamber, you probably imagined grace, clean skin, powdered cheeks, maybe a soft scent of lavender following her into the room. What rarely makes it into those fantasies is what she smelled like underneath all of that, or rather, what she didn't do to change it. Because for many royal women across centuries, hygiene wasn't a priority. It was almost treated like an afterthought. And not because they didn't care about appearances, they cared about them too much. But when it came to getting clean, to using soap and water, things became complicated. The first and possibly most surprising fact is that royal women didn't bathe very often, not even monthly. In some cases, barely once a year. This wasn't laziness, it was a belief. Doctors in the Middle Ages and even through the Renaissance warned that bathing could weaken the body. They thought water opened the pores, letting in disease. So instead of washing, women covered up. They used perfumes, powders, and oils to build a kind of fragrant barrier between themselves and the outside world. A royal woman didn't step into a tub of soap and bubbles. She stepped into a cloud of rosewater and civet, and that, somehow, was considered more refined. Perfume wasn't just an accessory, it was a shield. At the French court of Louis XIV, for example, nobles were known to reapply scent several times a day. Their dresses were soaked in floral waters, their gloves were lined with herbs, their hair was sprinkled with crushed flowers and sometimes even powdered bone. The goal was never to cleanse, only to conceal. One royal mistress proudly claimed to have only bathed twice in her life. Once when she was born, and once on her wedding night. No one found that strange. It was almost admirable. Why take a risk with water when you could just add more fragrance? Of course, this created a layering effect. Each day added another coat of oil, another dab of musk, another spritz of something floral. The result wasn't always pleasant. Behind the satin curtains and embroidered pillows, there was often a noticeable heaviness in the air. It smelled like orange blossoms, yes, but also like wool, like sweat, like something you couldn't quite place, but wouldn't want to breathe in too deeply. Still, guests smiled, they nodded, they complimented the scent, because to comment otherwise was to insult the court. The royal baths themselves, when they existed, were more symbolic than practical, made of marble or stone, with golden taps and carved lions' heads. They looked impressive, but they weren't used often. A queen might step into one on a ceremonial occasion. She might soak for half an hour in perfumed oils, then step out without ever touching a bar of soap. The water, reused for multiple baths, often sat cloudy and stale. Towels, if used, were decorative, embroidered, perfumed, sometimes stiff with starch. They were not absorbent. Many women simply stood by a fire afterward and waited to dry. And drying took time, especially when wearing layers. A standard outfit could include 5 or 6 garments, underdresses, corsets, overskirts, and cloaks, each one heavy, each one holding on to moisture like a sponge. So the goal was to avoid getting wet in the first place. The fewer times the body touched water, the easier the day. That was the logic. The body wasn't scrubbed, it was dabbed, it was painted, it was wrapped in lace and silk and expected to behave. Under all of this, the skin had to manage on its own. Royal women developed techniques to handle rashes, itching, and other consequences of rarely washing. Powders were used to soothe, but also to hide. A rash might be sprinkled with starch or covered with a beauty patch. If the skin broke out, it was covered with white lead. If it blistered, a little rouge helped blur the edges. Nothing was healed, only hidden. Appearance mattered more than comfort. Even the servants who helped dress these women learned to work without mentioning the smell. They learned how to fasten laces without pulling too hard on raw skin. They knew when to bring a fresh linen cloth and when to hold back. There were unspoken rules about what could be said loud. A queen might faint from heat and perfume, but no one blamed the corset or the musk. They simply opened a window and carried on. Sometimes, these hygiene habits led to infections. Skin broke down under the weight of unwashed fabric. Hair thinned from repeated layers of pomade and powder. But none of this showed in portraits. There, the royal woman looked perfect. Smooth cheeks, shiny curls, calm eyes. No one painted the sores or the bruises beneath the gown. The contradiction was clear, but accepted. To be royal was to look beautiful, not to be clean. Even cleanliness itself became suspicious. Washing too often was seen as vain, or worse, unnatural. A woman who washed daily might be compared to a courtesan. A queen who washed monthly was considered cautious, and the rest simply powdered, perfumed, and hoped for the best. What's curious is how normal this seemed at the time. No one questioned it. Royal women were taught from childhood to avoid water, to layer oils, to sit in scented smoke rather than steam. They weren't careless. They were following the best advice available. Even as they scratched beneath their pearls or blinked through the sting of their perfume, they believed they were doing the right thing. It's easy now to look back and laugh, to imagine the halls of Versailles as floral-smelling hothouses of discomfort. But in truth, they were elegant. They were admired. They were copied by courts across Europe. The smell was simply part of the package, and over time, it became invisible. The way background noise fades if you listen to it long enough. So if you've ever pictured yourself in a royal gown, walking through a candlelit palace, maybe take a moment to imagine what that would feel like. The weight of the dress, the heat of the room, the thick scent that clings to your sleeves and doesn't let go, and maybe, just maybe, you'll start to appreciate your soap a little more. Because, as we'll see in the next part, this was only the beginning. Under the gowns and the gloves, there was still more to hide, and even less to clean. And so, beneath all the satin and perfume, there was always more to cover, and more to avoid. One of the most curious things about royal hygiene was not what they did, but what they refused to do. Among these refusals, one stands out quite clearly: washing their clothing. Not just the grand outer garments, which were delicate and expensive, but also the underlayers, the clothes worn closest to the skin, the ones that collected every drop of sweat, every trace of body heat, every lingering scent of roast meat or rose water. These clothes, instead of being scrubbed and boiled like a washwoman might do, were handled with a different approach, an approach that involved patience, a sunny day, and sometimes a prayer. In most royal households, linen undergarments were considered self-cleaning. Not literally, of course, but close enough. It was believed that if you hung them in the breeze and let them air out properly, the sun and wind would take care of any unpleasantness. Washing them too frequently was seen as both unnecessary and dangerous. Hot water could weaken the fibres. Strong soap could ruin the fabric. Scrubbing was out of the question. Instead, they were gently brushed, maybe dabbed with a cloth soaked in alcohol or perfume, and then laid out on a chair by the window. That was enough. Supposedly, there are records of queens wearing the same shift for several days, sometimes even weeks, before allowing it to be refreshed. And refreshed rarely meant washed. It meant shaken out, sprayed with something floral, and occasionally rubbed with herbs. Lavender was a favourite, rosemary too, a little lemon balm if someone was feeling extra cautious, but soap and water, not unless necessary, and necessary usually meant visible stains, or smells so strong that even the servants began to notice. Of course, these undergarments were not simple things. They were carefully stitched, often embroidered, sometimes even perfumed at the time of their making. A queen's chemise might be trimmed with lace or edged with tiny pearls. It wasn't just clothing, it was part of her image, but it was still linen, still cloth, still something that touched her skin day after day. The fact that it wasn't regularly washed didn't mean it stayed clean. It just meant people pretended not to see, and so, in a court where appearances mattered more than comfort, there developed a kind of polite blindness. Everyone agreed to ignore the reality beneath the silk and brocade, the layers of unwashed linen, the stiff corsets that held in more than just a waistline, the secret stains, the dampness in the folds. It wasn't elegant, but it was accepted. No one spoke of it aloud, not unless they were writing letters home, far from the ears of court gossip. Some chambermaids kept quiet simply because they had no other choice. Their job was to fold the chemises, fasten the corsets, and carry out the perfumed cloths for airing. They weren't allowed to criticise. A wrinkled nose or a stray comment could mean dismissal, and for many of these women, a place in the Queen's household was the highest position they could hope to achieve. So they powdered, they brushed, they aired, and they stayed silent. In rare cases, when garments truly couldn't be salvaged, they were not cleaned, they were replaced, especially with underthings. A torn chemise might be cut into rags and sent to the scullery. A badly stained petticoat quietly burned in the fire. New ones were ordered. The idea was not to preserve, but to maintain the illusion. And that illusion was of a woman who was always fresh, always composed, and always just scented enough. But the truth lay in the seams. The longer something was worn, the more it absorbed. Not just sweat, but stress. Not just perfume, but fear. The court was not a relaxing place. Women sat through hours of ceremonies, stood through banquets, danced under hot chandeliers, all while tightly wrapped in fabric that refused to breathe. And when they returned to their rooms at night, they didn't undress and throw their clothing into a laundry basket. They unfastened it carefully, laid it out to air, and sometimes wore it again before breakfast. Even Elizabeth I, known for her meticulous appearance, had her undergarments cleaned sparingly. Some letters suggest that her laundresses used breadcrumbs to rub away marks. Not soap, not scrubbing, just gentle friction. A kind of royal dry cleaning, using kitchen supplies. One wonders if the birds in the garden noticed anything unusual about their morning crumbs. There were other methods too. Some women stored sachets of dried herbs in their drawers and chests. Others pressed ironed clothes between layers to absorb excess oil. A few even placed slices of lemon or orange peel in their closets. Not because they thought it would clean the fabric, but because the smell distracted from what wasn't clean. This was seen as a strategy, a way to redirect attention from what couldn't be fixed. And still, nobody questioned the system. They simply followed it, generation after generation. Advice passed down from mother to daughter, noblewoman to lady-in-waiting. Wash a little, air often, scent everything, and if it begins to smell too much like life, add more lavender, more rose petals, more powdered clove. Today, we might find this difficult to believe. We talk about hygiene like it's basic, like it's instinct, but for centuries it wasn't. It was luxury. It was dangerous. It was something best handled at a distance. For royal women, cleanliness was not about soap. It was about illusion. If no one mentioned the smell, then maybe it wasn't there. And so, night after night, beneath ceiling carvings and silk canopies, queens and princesses lay down in garments that had never been truly clean. They tucked themselves into beds lined with sheets that had been aired but not washed. They closed their eyes under blankets that smelled of cloves and camphor and memory, and they slept, as well as anyone could, knowing that the next day they would rise, powder themselves once more, and pretend. Because pretending, more than perfume, was the true foundation of royal hygiene. And in the next part, we'll step even further into that world of cover-ups and contradictions, to a place where perfume wasn't worn, but carried. Not just for beauty, but for survival. If perfume was the first layer of illusion, then accessories were the second. In the royal courts of Europe, especially during the 16th and 17th centuries, smell was not just a matter of vanity, it was a tool, a shield, sometimes even a weapon. And for women who had very little real power, scent became a quiet language. It told people where you stood, it announced your presence before you entered a room, and when needed, it protected you from the less charming realities of palace life. One of the most common tools in this quiet olfactory battle was the pomander, a small metal ball, often ornate, worn on a chain or tucked into a gown. Inside, it held a tightly packed mixture of herbs, resins, and dried flowers, clove, cinnamon, ambergris, rosemary. These were the most popular, chosen for their strong, lingering smells. When the air grew thick with candle smoke and sweat, a lady could simply lift her pomander to her nose and breathe something better. The fashion spread fast. At court, it was nearly expected. A woman without a pomander was either new or forgetful. Some wore theirs on long chains, swinging from the waist. Others kept them hidden in sleeves, close to the pulse. A few carried small perfumed cloths instead, laced with the same herbs and tucked into gloved hands. All of these served the same purpose, to give a moment of relief from a world that didn't believe in ventilation. And it wasn't just about comfort. People genuinely believed that bad smells could cause disease. The idea of miasma was deeply rooted. If you walked past a sick room and inhaled something foul, it wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. So, surrounding yourself with good smells was more than etiquette. It was protection, a kind of invisible armour. Elizabeth kept her rooms filled with potpourri and perfumed gloves. Her bedding was layered with sachets of dried lavender and herbs. Even her servants were instructed to keep scented cloths nearby. The goal was to maintain a space that smelled not just pleasant, but powerful. And the smell of power, it seemed, was a mix of roses, cloves, and a hint of desperation. Perfumed gloves were particularly popular. At first, they were a practical solution. Tanned leather didn't smell very nice, so glove makers began soaking their products in floral oils and spice infusions. Over time, these gloves became a fashion statement, a gift from one noble to another, a token of favour or affection. But they also had a more subtle function. Worn over hands that rarely touched soap and water, they helped hide whatever the sleeves could not. In some cases, the gloves were so saturated with perfume that they stained the skin. One ambassador reportedly complained that after shaking hands with a French duchess, he smelled of ambergris for the rest of the day. He didn't say whether he minded, only that the scent lingered longer than her conversation. Of course, not all smells could be managed so neatly. The royal palaces were busy places. Hundreds of people, animals, fires, meals, and open windows are all competing for the same air. Scented accessories helped, but they didn't erase the source. They just floated above it, like a polite lie. A distraction that made it easier to smile through a headache. To make things worse, many of these perfumes were made with ingredients that would horrify modern noses. Musk, for example, was harvested from the glands of animals. Ambergris comes from the digestive systems of whales. Civet was collected from the scent sacs of a small African mammal. These were expensive, rare, and considered luxurious, but they were also pungent, and sometimes even overwhelming. A little too much musk could clear a hallway faster than a poorly cooked roast. Still, women wore these scents proudly. They dabbed them on handkerchiefs, sprinkled them onto pillows, pressed them into hairpieces. Some even burned scented paste on small plates to fill the room before guests arrived. The goal was always the same: to create an atmosphere that felt clean, even if it wasn't. To convince both visitor and resident that beauty still reigned, even as the carpets held decades of dust. There's something quietly impressive about how committed they were to this system. They knew the clothes weren't clean. They knew the baths were rare. They knew the air was thick. And yet, they didn't give up. They just worked harder to hide it. Another ribbon, another sprig of herbs, another dip of the gloves into violet oil. It's tempting to laugh at all of this now, to imagine women walking through palaces like mobile spice racks. But there's also something relatable here. The need to control what little you can. To carve out a pocket of comfort in an environment you didn't design. For royal women, perfume wasn't an indulgence. It was survival. And maybe, in a court full of watching eyes and whispered judgment, smelling right mattered more than being right. A woman who carried the right scent might be remembered. One who didn't might be replaced. The truth is, royal courts were full of contradictions. They demanded perfection, but gave women few tools to achieve it. They admired beauty, but discouraged real maintenance. They expected grace, but provided no privacy. So women did what they could. They powdered. They perfumed. They stitched herbs into the lining of their dresses. They held pomanders to their faces and hoped the rest of the world wouldn't notice how hard they were trying. Because even if no one said it aloud, everyone knew. A pleasant smell was a social currency, a way of saying, I belong here. I understand the rules. I might not have control over the water, or the walls, or the rules that govern my life, but I can choose how I smell, and sometimes that was enough. The irony, of course, is that some of these fragrances caused their problems. They irritated the skin, they triggered coughing fits, in rare cases, they even caused fainting. But by the time anyone realised, the trend had already taken hold, and no one wanted to be the first to give it up. So the gloves stayed on, the herbs stayed tucked, the pomanders clicked quietly at the waist, swinging with each careful step through marble halls that smelled, underneath it all, like too many people and not enough soap. And in the next part, we'll see what happened when the smells were no longer a private matter, but something everyone in the room had to manage, including the Queen herself. By now, the court had grown used to pretending that everything smelled fine, that perfume solved everything, that a cloud of rose oil was enough to erase a month's worth of sweat under brocade. But sometimes, pretending wasn't enough. Sometimes, the problem didn't stay hidden behind silk. Sometimes, it made itself known in ways no pomander could fix. And that's when things got interesting. Because when the Queen herself had to go, the entire court had to pretend they didn't notice. Before modern plumbing, every royal residence had its way of dealing with nature's call. The chamber pot was the Queen's constant companion, discreet, portable, ceramic or pewter, and almost always disguised to look like something else. It might be tucked behind a privacy screen or placed beside a velvet-covered stool. It might even have a lid that clicked shut like a jewellery box. But it was still a pot, and it still had a job to do. In the middle of a long reception, a banquet, or a council meeting, the Queen couldn't excuse herself casually. There were no quiet hallways or nearby bathrooms. If she needed relief, she used what was available, and what was available was often close by. A lady in waiting would know the signs. She would gather the cloth, draw the screen, and everyone else would stare pointedly at the ceiling while trying to breathe through a scented handkerchief. This wasn't scandalous. It was routine. The court knew how to choreograph around it. Musicians played louder, pages shifted in and out, servants passed with trays, shielding the view. The moment passed. The curtain was drawn back, and the Queen continued as though nothing had happened. Everyone nodded and carried on. because pretending was polite. Pretending was survival. Afterward, the pot was taken away by servants trained in silence. They didn't speak. They didn't flinch. They didn't wrinkle their noses. They simply lifted the porcelain, held it steady, and walked carefully through the corridor until they reached a place no one wanted to think about. Some palaces had designated disposal chambers. Others had holes in the floor leading to collection pits. Either way, it was not a glamorous job, but it had to be done. And the smell that didn't just disappear, no matter how much perfume was sprayed afterward, it lingered, especially in heavy fabrics, especially in tapestries that hadn't been cleaned since the last rain. Even the thick stone walls soaked it in. So, courtiers began to carry scented fans, not just for heat, but to wave something pleasant toward their faces, to create a tiny breeze of denial in a room where denial was the main course. Elizabeth I had her system. She was said to keep perfumed gloves at her writing desk and dried herbs near her bedside. When she travelled, she brought her bedding, laced with lavender and camphor. But even she wasn't immune to the realities of palace life. There were times when she, too, had to pause a meeting, disappear behind a velvet screen, and trust that her ladies would keep the performance intact. And they did. Every time. Because a breach in decorum wasn't just embarrassing. It was dangerous. A moment of weakness could be interpreted as illness, and illness meant vulnerability. In a court full of hungry eyes, even the act of relieving oneself had to be wrapped in grace. It had to look like nothing had happened. It had to leave no trace. That's where accessories came back into play. Scented handkerchiefs were essential. Pomanders hung at the waist. Sprigs of herbs were stitched into sleeves. Some women even wore small pouches filled with mint and crushed petals inside their bodices, close to the skin. These weren't fashion choices. They were survival kits, weapons in the quiet war against smell. But smell wasn't the only thing at stake. There was also noise. In a silent chamber, a sound out of place could shift attention. So servants learned to hum softly, to drop something at just the right moment, to cough, move a chair, or open a window. Every motion was practiced. Every distraction is carefully timed. The goal was not just to hide what was happening, but to maintain the illusion that nothing ever needed to happen. This wasn't unique to England. Across Europe, royal women developed their codes. In France, the phrase "retired to her chamber" became a delicate way to explain an absence. In Spain, "she takes the air" often meant the queen had gone to a private corner with her trusted servant and a bucket disguised as a stool. The Austrians, ever precise, used bells to signal transitions, giving everyone enough time to turn politely away. The reality, of course, was that even queens are human, and no amount of civet oil or jasmine-scented gloves could change that. They sweated, they digested, they released. And then they powdered their cheeks, straightened their posture, and rejoined the room like nothing had ever happened. It's not surprising, then, that court etiquette books began to include entire sections on managing these moments. There were diagrams for arranging screens, instructions for folding cloth, recommendations for which scents worked best in summer. It became its system, a performance within the performance. Some courtiers took pride in mastering this dance. They could spot the moment a queen shifted in her seat. They knew how to pass a fresh cloth without drawing attention. They could refill the pot with rose water and return it without a sound. For them, invisibility was a talent, and the ability to pretend nothing smelled was a virtue. But for all their effort, the truth didn't disappear. It hung in the air, just faintly, just enough to remind everyone that the palace, for all its gold and grandeur, was still a building full of people. People are wearing too many layers. People are eating too much meat. People sharing small spaces with large consequences. Still, no one complained, at least not publicly, because to admit the Queen's chamber smelled like anything other than violets was to risk your position. So, ambassadors wrote their letters in private. Servants whispered in corners. and the rest of the court learned to live with it, or rather, to not mention it. After all, what was the alternative? Ask the Queen to wash more, suggest plumbing, recommend soap. No one was foolish enough to try. Instead, they adjusted. They learned to breathe shallowly. They learned to smile without sniffing. And they learned to praise the scent of roses, even when the room smelled more like life. In the next part, we'll move from what was happening behind the curtain to what was happening on the surface, because once the perfumes faded, the powders began. And if you think hiding smell was difficult, try hiding your skin. Powder was everywhere. It clung to faces, settled on collars, floated in the air like soft dust. In the royal courts of Europe, powder wasn't just part of a beauty routine, it was the routine. Applied with careful hands and serious intentions, it turned pale skin into porcelain, dark circles into smooth surfaces, and blemishes into something politely ignored, at least from a distance. Up close, the illusion didn't always hold, but that didn't matter, because at court, distance was part of the performance, and powder helped keep that performance alive. For royal women, pale skin wasn't just fashionable, it was necessary. A fair complexion suggested wealth, refinement, and the luxury of staying indoors. It marked you as someone who didn't need to work under the sun, someone who didn't sweat like a baker or smell like a stable. But achieving that look took more than good lighting. It took layers, and the ingredients in those layers were rarely kind. The most common foundation was made of white lead, mixed with vinegar, water, and sometimes even egg whites. It created a creamy paste that clung to the skin. The result was smooth, bright, and deadly. White lead is toxic, slowly, quietly toxic. It seeps into the skin, damages tissue, and weakens the immune system. But at the time, no one questioned it, because it worked. It covered scars, smoothed over smallpox marks, and gave the appearance of health, which, ironically, was destroying it. Rouge was next, a dab on each cheek, sometimes made from crushed beetles, sometimes from mercury-based compounds, just enough to look alive, just enough to balance the pale base without looking like you'd been walking too fast. Lip colour came last, a touch of red, made from cinnabar or plant dyes, applied with a small brush or fingertip. The whole process took time, and a steady hand, and occasionally a second person to assist with the angles. These cosmetics didn't come off easily. Most weren't meant to. Women slept in them, added more the next morning, touched up between meals. Washing it all off meant using oils, vinegar, or cloth soaked in alcohol, not water. Never water. That was still seen as risky. And so, instead of removing old layers, they added new ones, powder for powder, week after week. Eventually, the skin suffered. It blistered, cracked, and turned grey around the edges. In some portraits, you can see the damage if you look closely. A certain tightness in the jaw, a slight swelling under the eye. But painters were kind. They smoothed it out with their brushes, and the myth of flawless skin continued. To cover the worst of it, women used beauty patches, small shapes made from velvet, silk, or wax, placed carefully on the face, a star near the temple, a crescent by the mouth, a circle under the eye. They served a double purpose. Decoration, yes, but also concealment. A blister beneath a heart-shaped patch looked like fashion, not infection. The use of these patches became so common that they developed meanings. A patch on the right cheek meant flirtation, on the left, loyalty. Near the lips, secret desire. It became a game, a silent language spoken through felt and glue. But beneath the messages was a quieter truth. These patches were often hiding things no one wanted to talk about. Skin that had been powdered too many times, treated with too much mercury, scrubbed with too little care. And still, the powder kept coming. Each morning, Maids opened boxes of pressed lead, stirred bowls of rouge, cut fresh patches from black silk. They fanned away the residue that floated in the air, settled on furniture, and stuck to curtains. Some women developed coughs that never left. Some lost hair, others lost teeth. But they rarely blamed the powder. They blamed the air, the season, their nerves, anything but the thing they applied each day. It wasn't just vanity, it was an expectation. A woman who showed up to court without her face properly prepared might be described as tired, or worse, rude. Not putting in the effort was seen as a kind of insult. To the Queen, to the occasion, to the entire structure of noble life. So women kept powdering, even as their skin begged for air, even as their reflection stopped looking like themselves. Elizabeth I was known for her commitment to the powdered look. She had suffered from smallpox early in life, and though she survived, the scars never left her face. Instead of hiding away, she leaned into artifice. She wore thick white paste, heavy rouge, and elaborate wigs to distract. From a distance, she looked regal. Up close, the cracks showed, but no one dared mention them. Some courtiers took note in their private letters. One ambassador described her skin as strained porcelain. Another mentioned her eyes always seemed watery, as if irritated. But they wrote these things carefully, respectfully. Because to criticise a queen's appearance was to question her power, and powder, in its strange way, was part of that power. There's a quiet irony in all of this. In trying to look strong, they weakened themselves. In trying to appear untouched, they covered the very damage the court inflicted. But the alternative wasn't appealing. To show natural skin was unthinkable. It suggested poverty, illness, madness, even. So they painted on health. They powered on, and hoped the mirror would cooperate. Some women tried to modernise. They experimented with gentler mixtures, rice powder, ground pearl. But these were expensive, hard to find, and didn't cover as well. So they often returned to what they knew: lead, mercury, whatever it took. Because when beauty is expected, health becomes negotiable. Today, we think of makeup as a choice, a form of expression. But for these women, it was a mask they couldn't remove, not without consequences. It was survival in powdered form. A layer between them and judgment. And in the next part, we'll look at what happened when even the powder wasn't enough. When the damage beneath had to be dealt with, not just covered. A chapter that takes us into the world of teeth, and all the creative ways royal women tried to keep smiling, even when their mouths told a different story. The smile was expected, at banquets, at balls, during royal audiences. A calm, pleasant expression, composed lips, slightly parted, just enough to suggest warmth without effort. But beneath that soft smile, something else was going on. Because under the powder, past the rouge, behind the pearls and lace, royal teeth were quietly falling apart. Tooth decay was a fact of life in the royal courts. Sugar, once rare, became fashionable during the Renaissance and exploded in popularity by the 17th century. It was expensive, yes, but the rich had no shortage of it. Candied fruits, sweetened wine, honey-drenched pastries. These weren't occasional treats. They were daily indulgences, and the teeth paid the price. Dentistry, as we know it, did not exist. Toothbrushes were crude if they existed at all. Some used twigs with frayed ends. Others rubbed their teeth with linen cloths. A few had access to bristle brushes, often made from hog hair, but they were not widely used. More common was the use of powders. These could be made from ground eggshells, burnt bread, chalk, coral, or pumice. Applied with a cloth or fingertip, they were rough, gritty, and sometimes painful, but they gave the illusion of polish. The irony is that many of these powders did more harm than good. They stripped enamel, they irritated the gums, they created small cuts where food and bacteria could settle. Over time, teeth darkened, they loosened, they broke. But people didn't stop using the powders, because even with the damage, white teeth meant youth. And in court, youth was currency. When teeth fell out, and they often did, replacements were improvised. Ivory, bone, and even wood were carved to fit. Some sets were wired into place. Others were attached to existing teeth with metal clasps. None were comfortable. Most were only worn for short appearances, smiling for a portrait, posing at a feast, greeting a visiting noble. Afterward, they were removed, cleaned with wine or vinegar, and stored until the next occasion. There were even reports of teeth being taken from the mouths of the poor or dead. These donor teeth were sold to the wealthy, cleaned as best as possible, and inserted where needed. It wasn't hygienic, it wasn't safe, but it was effective enough. For a few months, maybe a year, until infection set in, or the gums rejected the foreign body. Then it was back to soft foods and tight-lipped smiles. Elizabeth, I was known to have suffered from tooth decay later in life. Some accounts describe her face as sunken, her speech slightly slurred, but she maintained appearances. She adjusted her makeup. She smiled carefully. She kept her distance when needed, because showing weakness, especially the kind that came from the mouth, was not acceptable. It suggested an age, decline, mortality, things no ruler wanted to admit. To help with the smell, people turned to breath fresheners. These weren't mints as we know them. They were concoctions of herbs, spices, and alcohol. Some chewed on cloves or fennel seeds, others were rinsed with vinegar or wine. A few kept sprigs of mint tucked inside their cheeks during events. The goal wasn't freshness, it was a disguise. If it didn't smell bad, it must be clean. At least that was the hope. One particularly theatrical solution was tooth jewels. When gaps appeared, some women glued small gems, pearls, rubies, even diamonds to their remaining teeth. The idea was to draw attention away from what was missing, to make the mouth sparkle. Even if the gums ached, it was not practical. The jewels often fell off, were swallowed, or had to be reapplied constantly. But for a moment, they were distracted, and in court, distraction was almost as valuable as beauty. To avoid losing more teeth, some women tried to eat less: soups, soft bread, stewed vegetables. But royal feasts didn't help. Meats were rich, desserts were sticky. Dishes were coated in sauces. The chewing never stopped, and with it, the slow erosion of dental health. No matter how gently they dabbed with vinegar or rubbed with a cloth, the damage continued. There were also attempts at pain relief. Toothaches were common and could be debilitating. Clove oil was applied directly to the gums. Alcohol-soaked cloths were pressed against the jaw. Some even turned to early forms of opium when available. But most suffered in silence. The Queen could not cancel a council meeting because her mouth hurt. She simply smiled through it, or pretended to. Portraits from this era rarely show teeth. When mouths are visible, they're closed, controlled. The ideal noble smile was one of calm restraint, not because restraint was elegant, but because anything more revealed too much. A missing molar, a discoloured incisor, a crooked bite. Better to keep the lips sealed and let the pearls do the talking. Some women wore veils or fans to hide their faces at certain angles. Others avoided conversation altogether. If a courtier leaned in too closely, there was a discreet step back, a pivot. A hand lifted with a scented glove. It became a silent dance, protecting one's image, one's dignity, one's decaying mouth, all without breaking the rhythm of court life. And yet, they endured. They learned how to smile without showing teeth, how to speak without opening wide, how to laugh behind a hand or a fan. Because in a world where everything was performance, even a damaged mouth had to be managed with grace. It's easy now to marvel at the inventions of modern dentistry: toothpaste, floss, and antiseptic rinse. But back then, the options were limited. Pain was normal, decay was expected, and beauty, once again, meant pretending. Pretending the teeth hadn't gone. Pretending the smile still held. So the next time you brush your teeth, consider this. Consider the court lady holding a ruby-studded toothpick. The queen is rinsing her mouth with red wine. The maid was scrubbing a wooden denture with a cloth dipped in lavender oil. They weren't careless. They were doing their best, with what they had, in the place they lived. And in the next part, we'll move from the mouth to something even more ambitious, the full body. Because as much as they tried to cover their skin with powder, they also tried to fix what they thought was wrong inside. And that meant turning to medicine, the kind that came with leeches, lancets, and far too much blood. When powder and perfume could no longer hide what the body carried, and when smiles became too painful to maintain, royal women turned to the one solution they believed might fix what lay beneath the skin. They turned to medicine, or rather, to what passed for medicine in their world, a world where balance was everything, and where imbalance had only one answer: release. Bloodletting was one of the most common medical practices among royalty. It was used to treat fevers, fatigue, rashes, mood swings, digestive issues, and even melancholy. Almost any discomfort, if left unexplained, could be blamed on too much blood. The logic followed the ancient belief in the four humours of the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. To be healthy was to keep them in balance, and when blood seemed to rise above the rest, it had to be let out. The process was not subtle. It involved sharp tools, careful timing, and a remarkable amount of ceremony. Royal physicians did not simply poke and hope. They used ornate lancets, often made of silver or gold, sometimes engraved with coats of arms. These were not just medical instruments. They were symbols of authority, of control, of precision. But no matter how beautiful the handle, the blade still pierced skin. The location of the cut mattered. The arm was common, especially near the elbow. The foot was used for certain ailments. In more serious cases, the neck or behind the ear. The chosen spot depended on what the physician believed needed balancing, and often it depended on the phase of the moon. Astrology played a quiet but persistent role in royal medicine. A poor alignment might delay the procedure. A favourable one might encourage extra sessions. Royal women did not always go willingly, but they were expected to submit, especially when symptoms became visible. A swelling in the joints, a persistent rash, a sudden change in temperament. These were not just signs of discomfort. They were warnings that something inside had turned, that the body, once calm and controlled, was now rebelling. And the physician's job was to bring it back into order, to encourage the process. Additional methods were used: mustard plasters, vinegar compresses, heated stones pressed to the skin to draw blood to the surface. Once the blood flowed, it was collected in a basin, observed, and often described in detail: thick or thin, bright or dark, fast or slow. Each trait told the doctor something, or at least they believed it did. Sometimes the bloodletting worked, not because it cured the illness, but because the patient felt lighter, calmer. The pain eased temporarily. Other times it made things worse. Too much blood removed meant weakness, dizziness, fainting. But these effects were rarely blamed on the procedure. They were seen as necessary consequences, proof that the body had been corrected. And when blood was not enough, sweat became the next path to healing. The body, they believed, could release illness through pores, so women were wrapped in layers of cloth, placed near fires, and forced to sweat for hours. Herbs were burned nearby to assist. Basil, mint, rosemary. The air grew thick. The body is wet, and still they remained, waiting for the fever to break, for the balance to return. These sweat cures were uncomfortable, exhausting, and at times humiliating, but they were also private. carried out in bedrooms or side chambers, watched over by maids who had been taught how to comfort without questioning. A woman emerging from such treatment was often pale, weak, and more than a little resentful, but she powdered her face, perfumed her hands, and returned to court, as expected. The more elaborate the court, the more elaborate the cures. At Versailles, entire rooms were set aside for bleeding and sweating, tapestries on the walls, cushions on the chairs, perfumed water in silver bowls. Everything was arranged to make the unpleasant seem elegant, to make illness appear manageable, even routine. But it was not routine for the women themselves. Each session was a reminder that their bodies were not their own. They belonged to a lineage, to expectation, to the performance of health, even in weakness. They didn't ask if the treatment was effective. They asked if it was necessary, and once the physician said yes, the rest followed. Some women believed deeply in these rituals. They fasted before treatment, prayed during, gave thanks afterward. Others endured them with clenched jaws and silent resentment. But regardless of belief, participation was not optional. A woman who refused treatment risked being labelled difficult, or worse, unstable. And so the lancet remained part of life. So did the fire. So did the herbs and the silence. There are letters from this time that speak of queens who bled monthly, not because of illness, but because it was recommended. As a form of maintenance, like brushing hair or trimming nails, the physician visited, the bowl was prepared, and another few ounces of blood joined the belief that health could be managed by subtraction. It is easy to forget, now, just how little was known about the body. There were no microscopes in those rooms, no understanding of bacteria or infection, only patterns, observations, and the belief that the body, if handled firmly, would comply. If it did not, the failure was moral, not medical. And if the Queen could endure it, so could everyone else. Her calm face during bloodletting was taken as a model. Her silence during the sweat cures was praised. No one spoke of the scars, or the side effects, or the quiet exhaustion that came with always being treated but never really healed, because treatment, like everything else in court, was performance. It had to look clean. It had to appear controlled. And if that meant draining blood under candlelight, with the scent of rosemary hanging in the air, then so be it. But behind those scented cloths and ceremonial tools, the body kept its truth. It weakened. It trembled. It grew tired of being balanced and restored. And still, it endured. Because queens did not get to fall apart. They were held together by habit, by duty, and by the belief that looking well mattered more than being well. And in the next part, we'll explore what happened when the performance extended beyond the living, when beauty standards followed royal women into death, and their bodies were prepared not for rest, but for display. There was no real end to the performance. Even in death, royal women were expected to look composed, clean, untouched. The moment breath left the body, another kind of preparation began, this time not for a banquet or a ball, but for something more permanent. The body would be seen, carried, watched by courtiers, ambassadors, and sometimes the public. And so, it had to be beautiful, or at least not alarming. Embalming was not new. In royal circles, it was a careful tradition. Not everyone agreed on how it should be done, but everyone agreed it had to be done. The process varied from country to country, and from one reign to the next, but the goal was always the same: preserve what remained, cover what changed, and never, ever let the scent of decay reach the velvet curtains. The first step was washing, which came as a strange irony. Many royal women had gone most of their lives avoiding soap and water. Now, in death, their bodies were finely washed, but not with ordinary soap. Instead, they were bathed in mixtures of herbs, oils, and wine. Lavender and rose were popular choices. Myrrh was used in some traditions. In wealthier courts, perfumed alcohol was poured carefully over the limbs, not just to cleanse, but to purify. After the washing came the packing. The body had to be dried, and that meant stuffing. Cavities were filled with sawdust, herbs, and sometimes fabric soaked in camphor. In France, doctors used aromatic paste made from spices and honey. In England, they sometimes used wax. The idea was not just preservation, it was control. No swelling, no sinking. Nothing reminded the viewer that this was no longer a living person. Cosmetics followed. Powder was applied to the face to smooth the skin tone. Rouge was brushed onto the cheeks. Lips were sometimes tinted. If the skin had darkened or bruised, it was covered with cloth or patches. Wigs were adjusted. Hands were arranged just so. And the eyes, if not sewn shut, were closed with care and pressed gently to create the look of calm. Clothing was chosen with purpose. It had to reflect dignity, status, and softness. Some queens were buried in state robes, others in simple white linen, but always with detail, embroidery, jewels, gloves, rings. The body was not just being buried, it was being seen, and every thread mattered. The coffin was often more elaborate than the bed the woman had slept in. Velvet lining, polished wood, silver trim. In some cases, it was open for days, set on display in a cold chapel, guarded by servants holding candles. People came to pay their respects. They bowed, they whispered, they studied the face for signs of peace or judgment. No one admitted to looking for the powder, but everyone knew it was there. Some queens had specific instructions for their post-mortem care, wills that described how they wanted to be dressed, what scents should be used, even who was allowed to touch them. These weren't vanity. They had a reputation. The final image mattered. For some, it mattered more than anything else. And beneath all the ritual was a quiet truth. These preparations were not only for the dead, they were for the living, to comfort them, to reassure them, to remind them that even in death, order remained, that the royal body, though lifeless, was still sacred, still perfect, still held together by the same rules it had followed in life. But not everything could be hidden. In warm weather, the embalming didn't always hold. There are accounts of queens whose bodies had to be rouged, whose lips had to be retouched before each viewing. One particularly unsettling record describes the smell creeping into the corners of a cathedral, forcing the guards to rotate every hour. Another tells of a veil being placed hastily across the face, midway through a procession. Still, no one said a word. They bowed, they walked, they held their breath and praised her grace. Because death, like everything else at court, had its script, and no one wanted to forget their lines. Behind the closed doors of preparation rooms, maids and apothecaries worked quietly. They adjusted the folds, they reapplied perfume, they replaced the wilting flowers on the chest. No applause waited for them, no recognition, but their work shaped the memory that would last. Sometimes, relics were taken. A lock of hair, a piece of lace, a glove. These items were treasured, kept in small boxes and passed down, not as reminders of love, always, but as proof of having been near, of having touched something important, something preserved. And when the funeral ended, and the body was finally lowered into the crypt, the scent remained, in the room, in the clothes of the attendants, on the pages of letters written that week. It lingered longer than expected, as if to say that beauty, once applied, did not give up easily. Even centuries later, when royal tombs are opened for study, traces of these rituals are found. Bits of fabric still hold the smell of cloves, hair still carries wax, rings are still set on fingers that were arranged with care, and the face, even if sunken, still shows the remnants of rouge pressed on long ago. It is strange, perhaps, to think of a queen being powdered after death, to imagine her cheeks being tinted by a maid with trembling hands. but in the logic of court life, it made perfect sense. The body was never just a body, it was a symbol, a vessel, a mirror of power. So the rituals continued, not out of superstition, not out of fear, but out of habit, out of loyalty, and maybe, just maybe, out of affection. In the next part, we will return to the realm of the living, where rituals were still part of daily life, and where privacy, for a royal woman, was often just a curtain and a prayer. Privacy was a rare thing for royal women. Almost everything they did was observed, commented on, and carefully recorded. From the way they entered a room to the way they sat at dinner, every movement carried meaning. But when it came to personal hygiene, that same attention became a burden, because even the most basic bodily functions had to be carried out under the watchful eye of the court, and behind the curtain, so to speak, there was very little space to breathe. The royal bedchamber was never truly private. It was a stage set with fine linens, glowing candles, and a line of waiting servants. Each woman had a routine, and each routine required help. Getting dressed, getting undressed, preparing for sleep, even washing. When it happened, it was a group effort. The queen did not fetch her water, she didn't carry her towel, and when she was finished, she did not clean the basin. For most royal women, the best they could hope for was a folding screen. Something tall enough to block part of the view, but not so wide that it disrupted the room. Behind it, they could bathe, or more often, dab themselves with scented cloths. These clothes were prepared in advance, soaked in floral waters or diluted vinegar. They were warm when used, sometimes scented with rose, sometimes with lavender. The act was not vigorous, it was delicate, a kind of slow-motion wipe, enough to remove surface dirt, not enough to disturb what lay underneath. The clothes were not washed after every use, that would have been wasteful. Instead, they were aired, draped over chairs or window frames, left out for the breeze to do its work, then folded and returned to the table by the next morning. Servants understood this rhythm. They knew what to do and when to do it, and most of the time, they said nothing. Silence was expected. Silence was professional. Even so, mistakes happened. A servant entered too soon. A maid dropped the wrong clothes. A screen shifted. In those moments, everyone froze. The air grew thick, and then, just as quickly, the performance resumed. A quiet apology, a glance away, a distraction offered, perhaps a change of subject, because dignity had to be preserved, even if only in fragments. The real challenge came during travel. Moving from palace to palace meant adjusting to new rooms, new staff, and often worse conditions. Privacy disappeared almost completely. Royal carriages were not comfortable. They were cramped, loud, and slow. Stops were infrequent. When nature called, the options were limited. A lady in waiting would hold a cloth, another would shield with a fan. The chamber pot might be tucked under the seat. No one spoke. No one made eye contact. The queen would emerge composed. The pot would disappear. Life went on. In larger palaces, some efforts were made to provide personal space. Alcoves, side rooms, even enclosed closets. But these were used by many, and they were not always clean. The smell lingered. The stone floors stayed cold, and the water, when it came, was never quite warm enough. So many women avoided the process altogether. Better to perfume than to risk a cold. Better to layer another petticoat than to remove the one already worn. Undergarments were considered part of the solution, made of linen. They were believed to absorb sweat and protect the outer layers. They were worn for days, sometimes weeks, without washing. When removed, they were aired, not scrubbed. Stains were brushed. Spots were treated with herbs. Only in the worst cases were they soaked, and even then, with care. No boiling, no harsh soap, just patience and sun. The belief was that natural fibres, if left in the open air, would purify themselves. So the windows were kept open, clothes hung beside them, scented satchels were tucked inside sleeves and bodices, lavender was common, rosemary, sometimes lemon peel. It helped, but not enough. The odour of lived-in garments lingered, and no curtain could block that completely. For those who could afford it, new garments were always being made, a chemise for travel, another for feast days, another for mourning, but not everyone replaced things often. Some women grew attached to familiar pieces. They adjusted hems, patched seams, and added lace to hidewear. The illusion of newness was maintained, even when the fabric had long since lost its shine. And through it all, the servants remained present, holding out towels, brushing wrinkles, lighting the fire, preparing the scented cloths without comment. Their presence was constant. Their hands are steady, their eyes lowered. They were part of the room, but not the story. Until something went wrong. A fainting spell, a dropped basin, a reaction to perfume. In those moments, the illusion cracked and the reality of being human reappeared. Quickly, someone stepped forward. A maid caught the fall. Another whispered instructions. A third offered a cloth. Within minutes, the court resumed. The curtain reset. The Queen smiled, and all was forgotten. It is easy to imagine these women as pampered, surrounded by help, free from labour, but the truth was more complicated. To live without privacy is to live without pause. Every gesture is measured, every movement rehearsed. There was no room to be tired, no space to be unwell, only the routine, and the hope that no one noticed when it slipped. Even letters from the period show how rare solitude was. Queens wrote of longing for quiet, for space, for time alone. Some retreated to gardens, others to prayer, but the world followed. The expectations never stopped, and the curtain, no matter how heavy, could not block everything. So they learned to live with it, to embrace the curtain as both shield and stage, to make the rituals look elegant, to hide discomfort with grace, and to count each moment of stillness as rare. In the next part, we will explore how royal women dressed not just for fashion, but for function, how every layer, every lace, and every clasp served a purpose, not always a comfortable one, but always deliberate. Dressing was never simple. For royal women, putting on clothes was closer to an architectural process than a casual act. It required layers, planning, and assistance. Every piece had its reason. Some layers held shape, others absorbed sweat. A few were purely decorative, but even those played their part in keeping up appearances. Comfort, as usual, was not the point. The goal was control of the body, of the image, of what could be seen and what had to be hidden. The first layer was usually linen, a chemise or smock, soft enough to touch the skin, but sturdy enough to hold up through repeated wear. This layer caught most of the sweat and body oils. It was the garment least likely to be washed often, yet closest to the skin. Over time, the fabric yellowed. It softened. It shaped itself to the body it served. Some women had dozens. Others relied on a few favourites, but all of them treated this layer as essential, even if it rarely showed. Next came the stays or corset. Boned with whalebone or stiffened with reeds, this piece pressed the body into an acceptable shape, not just a smaller waist, but a straighter posture, lifted chest, and rigid silhouette. Wearing it was not optional. It marked the difference between private and presentable, between waking and being seen. Tying it required help. Tightening it took strength. Loosening it, even briefly, was considered indulgent. Most women wore it from morning until night. After the corset came the petticoats, sometimes one, often two or three. They added volume, they smoothed lines, they helped keep outer garments from clinging too closely. In cold weather, they were insulated. In warm weather, they trapped heat. Still, they were worn, because without them, the gown would not fall correctly. The weight was part of the look. The gown itself varied by time and country. Some are laced in the front, others buttoned in the back. Sleeves were often separate, tied on with ribbons or sewn into place. The fabric could be velvet, brocade, silk, or wool, lighter materials for spring, heavier ones for winter, but all thick, all rich, all are difficult to wash, which meant they were rarely cleaned and frequently perfumed. Each outfit was chosen with care. Colour mattered, cut mattered, embellishments mattered. A dress with pearls stitched into the seams said something. So did a pattern of gold thread. So did the number of buttons, the placement of lace, and the length of the train. Nothing was accidental. Even mourning clothes, meant to be simple, followed strict codes. Black for a queen, grey for a cousin, purple for a child. Each thread had rules. Accessories completed the outfit. Gloves, sometimes perfumed, a fan, always close at hand, a small pouch for herbs or charms,